Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show, where I'm going to be discussing this book, A Social History of Analytic Philosophy, with its author, Christoph Schuringa. Welcome, Christoph. You're teaching philosophy in London, I believe. Am I right about that?
I am, yes. Yeah. So I teach at Northeastern University in London.
Awesome. And this book, I guess the first thing that I was interested in is about like your motivations and goals and stuff in writing it. Is it a plan that you had in mind for a while in terms of something that you wanted to do to understand analytic philosophy from a particular sort of angle?
It's got a little bit of a history. I really started, got going on a project like this during the pandemic, when a lot of us found that we had time to reflect about all sorts of things that we wouldn't otherwise have time to reflect on. And so the sort of immediate trigger, or sort of efficient cause for getting started on the project, was that I started thinking about, whatever happened to the calls for something called post-analytic philosophy, which goes back to the 1980s. And I became sort of increasingly curious about how it could be that people had said we need to sort of move somehow beyond analytic philosophy. And these are people often from within analytic philosophy saying this, and they just sort of kept saying it. And so analytic philosophy never really got to the point where it was over or in a place to be transcended, where you could have such a thing as post-analytic philosophy. And that then sort of led me into thinking, well, what sort of a thing must analytic philosophy be as a kind of, social formation, as a kind of a group of people engaged in something common? And of course, analytic philosophers themselves will worry a great deal about whether to say school or movement or tradition, and we can talk about some of those things and the differences between them. Anyway, this sort of grouping, that it can continue to feel like it's sort of coming to its end, but it seems actually sort of incapable of doing so. And that, in my mind, is quite strongly associated with the sort of tendency, which is sort of interesting to observe sociologically among analytic philosophers, which is that they, I think increasingly in the last few decades, have started to have the attitude of saying they're not really analytic philosophers, or they're not really wedded to the idea that there's a program or a school or a movement or a tradition called analytic philosophy that they belong to, as if it's sort of something that they perhaps sort of don't care about that much anymore, or that invested in. And that is interesting as someone who's worked a lot in the history of philosophy and history of European philosophy, and has a lot of contact with people, and have been engaged in debates that sort of happen outside of the sort of analytic mainstream of philosophy. It's very palpable for people who are outside of that mainstream that there really is such a thing as analytic philosophy, and they really experience it and its effects all the time. So I became very interested in how all of that can be the case. And it seemed to me like the way to get some handle on that would be to go back into the history, which is a really interesting history because in some sense it's been so little studied as a history. So to try and sort of excavate what it might be about this movement as it's being formed, culturally and politically, and in the context in which philosophers, like all human beings, have to live, to try and come to understand how it could have these really quite curious characteristics.
In terms of your sort of personal background with philosophy, your formation, what's your relationship to analytic philosophy been? Do you have like a background that was firmly in that tradition? Did you decide to leave that tradition, or were you kind of always more in a different camp? What's that sort of story?
I suppose I have quite a sort of specific personal history with analytic philosophy. So I went to study as an undergraduate at Cambridge, and not to get too autobiographical, but I think some of the background to why I went there and what I had in mind in thinking, well, I'll apply to Cambridge, is sort of relevant, I think. So I, as a teenager, had become very interested in intellectual and cultural history, and I'd read, for example, Peter Gay's big 2-volume work on the Enlightenment, and this had completely captivated me, and I thought I wanted to know more about philosophy, and I thought of philosophy very much in terms of a kind of great succession of historical figures at this point. And Cambridge, in my mind, was really associated with a tradition, right, that of Russell and Wittgenstein in particular. I'm not sure that I'd really heard of G.E. Moore or read anything by him, but anyway, there was this place where I thought there's a great sort of tradition that as a young aspiring student you might sort of try and attach yourself to. And I got to Cambridge and it was very different in a way that was really striking, because there was an air, this is the early 2000s, and I think it was more so then than it is now. Very small department with a small number of people working in really the traditional areas of analytic philosophies, especially philosophy of language and logic, maybe some metaphysics. And there was an air of, we don't really need the history of philosophy because we're philosophers, not people just studying what other people thought. I actually have quite a lot of respect for that attitude, and I think it has its place, and it can be very valuable especially to say to students, what do you actually think, right? Rather than don't just
debunk all the arguments with social explanations or something. Like there's that and there's that. They're both like they can both coexist.
Yeah. So then my experience was, it was really like being sort of plunged into a cold pool of analytic philosophy. And at the end, in the last year, it was possible to take papers, as they were called there, on Hegel and Nietzsche in particular were the ones that I became interested in. And from there, my work has been mostly in the history of 19th century German philosophy and to some extent 20th century philosophy, always quite historical in orientation. And so I moved away from that initial encounter with the analytic way, but it's, I suppose, always been with me, this kind of question about how to make sense of my stance with respect to the analytic tradition, and just a desire to think about it historically, because it increasingly seemed to me interesting to ask this question about a movement in philosophy that thinks of itself in such ahistorical terms, right? It thinks of itself almost as if doesn't quite go on to say this, but it almost says it doesn't have a history. Of course, it doesn't say that because it would be sort of manifestly self-contradictory to say that. So I've been sort of led back to some of those, I suppose, early experiences as a philosophy student, and then later mediated very much through contact with people who I would describe as analytic philosophers, who have a much more complicated relationship to it. So John McDowell in particular was a philosopher I later, as I sort of developed and started to know more about philosophy, I became very, very interested in. And McDowell has a kind of, there's a kind of Kantian turn in McDowell and even a sort of Hegelian turn. So it's a much more complicated question about how someone like McDowell then relates to some of his primary interlocutors, people like Gareth Evans and Donald Davidson, who are central figures in the analytic tradition.
I guess one of my reasons for asking this question is I'm aware that maybe the majority of my audience lean towards analytic philosophy, but there's also people who I guess are in my audience that disagree with me, and I'm very critical of analytic philosophy, but who are super in favor of it. And I guess I want maybe so they hear you out or listen to what you've got to say, don't just dismiss you as someone who's not got any idea of what the tradition is, or is coming from a particular perspective that's just immediately biased against analytic positions, and so can be kind of explained away without having to think about what you've got to say beforehand or something like that.
I mean, something I wanted to put across very strongly in the book, and I hope I've succeeded in this, is how much respect I have actually for the tradition. I mean, in a sense, the main point of the book is really that it is a tradition and it should be recognized as such, and that it transforms itself over time in a very interesting ways. And I was very keen to spend quite a lot of the book on philosophical arguments and philosophical ideas. And of course, given the very broad sweep of the book, it's possible to do so only in a relatively cursory way. But I really wanted to give a sense, for example, what Kripke's arguments are in naming and necessity, because it's important to me that the book is a history of philosophy. It's not, the history of, or the social history of what a lot of people did and what positions they held, or what the power politics of institutions were, or how journals functioned, although all of this is relevant. And then to regard, what people actually thought as a kind of, as sort of incidental. And there have been approaches to sort of doing something like a social history of analytic philosophy that's much more a kind of I would say, debunking approach, where the idea is to really take down even someone like Bertrand Russell and suggest that he wasn't as good a philosopher as people think he was. And that's really very much not my intention. I'm very interested in what the limits of analytic philosophy are. But I wanted to spend quite a bit of time with the ideas and the arguments so that readers could come to get a particular kind of take on how we might understand the functioning of ideology, as I would put it, in the manner in which people come to certain views and why they sustain and reproduce certain views.
I've got to unmute myself. So I guess initially about the method, I've got a question about like what a social history is. And there's a quote on page 198 from yourself where it says, it might seem eccentric to try to explain the return of metaphysics in terms of social history, and even more so if the driving explanation is to be a social history of logic. But the notion that there could be a social history of logic, and in particular of modal logic, is not entirely without precedent. And then, you go on to give justifications and things. So I'm wondering, what is a social history? Is there sort of a mode of explanation there, and what should people's expectations be for those sorts of explanations?
So I would say there isn't sort of one mode of explanation that would in turn explain what I do in the book. And that's an important thing to emphasize, because I think so there are various audiences for the book, right? And one audience is very much analytic philosophers themselves. And then there's people interested, sort of philosophy interested people. And then there are people even slightly further out from, concerned directly with the question of the status of analytic philosophy. And the analytic philosophers, I think, often assume that if you engage in something that you call a social history, you must have some kind of one explanatory framework, which is the framework of social history. And I think often the assumption is that you are doing something like explaining why people have certain ideas purely in terms of something that seems completely unrelated. So class interests, for example, right? So you explain that, I don't know, David Wiggins has a certain kind of view because he went to a particular boarding school in England. So that would seem to me from the start a very unpromising way to try and do this. So maybe it's helpful to say something substantively about the sort of how the book progresses, just to bring out that there are sort of different modes of social history that are involved. So, I mean, early on in the book, so the first few chapters of the book are really concerned with a set of distinct movements that are very methodologically self-conscious and that think very carefully about what they're doing in philosophy, and that arise in different places. So the important, in terms of the ones I cover in the book, the important ones are Cambridge and Vienna. Poland is also very important, but it's sort of beyond the scope of the book. And there you've got movements that emerge in very specific contexts, and the differences between them, I think, are largely explained by, or importantly explained by, the particular political situations in which those movements arise. So in the case of Vienna, it's very difficult to understand. So if you read the so-called manifesto of the Vienna Circle, that text on the face of it looks really confusing to a reader at our sort of vantage point in history, because it seems like they're sort of effortlessly combining some of the key ideas of liberalism with some quite radical social democratic ideas. And in this period, social democratic still means more or less Marxist. And so I spend quite a bit of time explaining the confluence of those two things and how they actually make sense as part of a world conception, as these people put it. They don't have a world view. That's something too metaphysical for them. But they have this world conception in which these things sort of seamlessly come together. And that has a lot to do with the nature of Austria as this place that is the kind of remnant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the First World War, in which there's a number of what we would now probably call populist movements, populist political movements, sort of irrationalist movements in which the masses are trying to be captured by kind of charismatic leaders.
There's a certain undefinable word that is not allowed to be used, beginning with an F. No,
yeah, that's there very much. Really, really crucial background to the Vienna Circle. And so you see liberals and these radical social democrats uniting in a kind of project of, they would even use this kind of phraseology, universal enlightenment. So they're trying to capture the masses with reason, basically. And this is a very, very interesting and a very ambitious program. So I think there has to be a social history of that, which is, I suppose, relatively straightforwardly social history, because it's really looking at how ideas seize the masses in Vienna, and how some of the people in the Vienna Circle, of whom it's very striking that, basically all of them were involved in adult education in a really far-reaching way. By far-reaching, I mean they taught a lot of hours at these colleges. So they were really doing this. So that's one kind of social history. And then as the book progresses, it's one of my claims that what we now recognize as analytic philosophy is a phenomenon that really gets established in the United States after the Second World War, in the particular situation, sort of global situation that you have, where the US emerges as the one leading global power, which is completely unprecedented, and has as its rival the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere of influence, a rivalry that's sort of largely imagined in terms of the way the United States thinks about it, the military threat from the Soviet Union and so on. But in that context, where you actually get those earlier movements from before the Second World War that were all distinct from each other and were often disputing with each other over philosophy, they become, in a way surprising and striking way, they become sort of amalgamated into this one sort of core thing called analytic philosophy, which then slowly starts to take over the philosophy departments of American universities. So then the mode of explanation that I adopt in the book really changes, because now we've got not that there's a set of core ideas about what philosophy is and how it should work, as you do, for example, with the Vienna Circle, right? So the Vienna Circle thinks all rational inquiry is empirical inquiry. And so philosophy either must be one of those, right? It must be empirical inquiry itself, or it must be some kind of special kind of meta-inquiry that's holding empirical inquiry together and so on. You don't have any of that anymore, because in a way that's, I think, very interesting, the key figures in analytic philosophy as it becomes established in the late 40s and the 50s, so people like W.V. Quine and Wilfrid Sellars, start to write these papers in which they bring some of the most fundamental notions on which analytic philosophy rests. So, for example, the notion of conceptual analysis, which seems really, really important, or the notion of using empirical inputs as the foundations of empirical knowledge. These sorts of ideas, which had been so central to the ancestor movements, are themselves being put into question. And in a way, what makes analytic philosophy then hang together is that it's this group of people, ever increasingly large in size as the academy expands, who are engaged in a set of questions that derive from those of the ancestor movements, in which basically nothing methodological is held in common that they can all agree on, but there's a set of ways of speaking, types of argumentation, very much a shared body of literature, which are the sources, the things that you're supposed to read. And it's very clear you're not supposed to read Merleau-Ponty. If you're interested in perception, you don't go and read this great big book, Phenomenology of Perception, that's somehow outside. And you know that if you're an analytic philosopher. But so then the mode of explanation, I think, really has to change, because then what you've got is analytic philosophy as Richard Rorty put this in 1979, he said in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, that now analytic philosophy could really only be understood as a sociological phenomenon, by which he meant, it's a phenomenon, the unity of which is constituted by groups of people behaving together in particular ways. So the latter part of the book is much less sort of involved with what you might call actual politics. It's much more interested in ideology, sort of ideological formations. Something I should maybe add is that there is a way of understanding the phrase social history very widely employed by historians, where it means something like history from below, or it means something like looking at ordinary people rather than rulers, or rather than the diplomatic classes and so on. Of course, you can't really do that for philosophy and for other intellectual disciplines that mainly take place in elite universities, because of course, you can have a social history that's the history of a social formation where that formation is itself the bourgeoisie or the ruling class. But it's probably important to say that. That's one reason why there haven't been many social histories of philosophy sort of at all, and where you get them. So a book, it's now one book. It used to be two books, but Verso have done it as one volume. Ellen Meekson's Wood's Social History of Political Philosophy, which is largely a history of the ideology of the ruling classes as laid down in political philosophy. So there's some precedent there.
So just I guess a couple of things. As a reader, I would say I think it is definitely accessible for people who don't have like a massive like academic philosophy background, but also I think there's enough detail and tidbits and things like that there for it to also be like very useful for people who do. And yeah, I think also that line between, like maybe speculating too much or trying to debunk people, I don't think you really like cross that line. I think you sort of lay out a lot of those contextual details and then also do the arguments justice on their own terms and kind of leave them together quite a lot. And I also think that for what you're trying to characterize, as I've noticed, trying to put together, an order of questioning to go through the book that will relate to people's understanding of analytic philosophy, it's quite hard to there's quite a lot of different stories, and it's hard to like weave that all together into like one overarching story that fits together as well. And I think you do a good job at all of that. I wonder on that last point that you mentioned, well, I mean, did you have a goal? And this is because I genuinely don't perceive this coming across in the book. So, if it maybe it's a part of that careful kind of like maybe demarcation between the two. But, was there a goal at all to change around a common idea that sometimes people have, where sometimes people will think, philosophers sort of, I don't know, sit on top of Mount Olympus casting down theories or something, and then, the ordinary world or the folk or something, and economics and science and politics, they all receive these theories from these, great geniuses of history, and that shapes and forms culture. And that's what philosophy is doing. And so if you want to be a great person of history, you should study philosophy or something like that. That's maybe one idea. I mean, I've seen it even put forward in sort of popularized as ideas like Jordan Peterson, for example. And then I guess maybe there's an opposite way of looking at it, which is more, these people are very much a product of backgrounds that they were born into and culture at the time and the economics of the time. I mean, do you feel that you've got a particular dog in that fight? Do you just want to kind of highlight that both exist? Do you want to push people in one direction?
Well, I think philosophy is here because I think you do get it going in both directions, and you get kind of complex interplay of the two directions. So I mean, I guess in terms of sort of the vibe of the thing, that what I want to put across in the book is more, if I've got the order right, I think the first thing that you said, which is so to kind of correct the idea that culture is just shaped by philosophers, and philosophers, John Locke has some big idea, empiricism, and then that because John Locke is so brilliant, which he was in many ways, also deeply flawed philosopher, but brilliant, and incredibly energetic in the way that he built a philosophical approach and makes it vivid and so on, right? And it really does percolate through culture in a certain sense. But the sort of picture that, well, the philosophers decide what the ideas are and then they sort of get percolated is something I very much wanted to sort of go against and show the ways in which philosophers are very much subject to the same pressures and influences as all other human beings, and they're very much part of a class formation. And that all of this plays a role. But of course, it's nonetheless true that philosophers also have influence and that ideas have influence. So, I mean, to sort of take a concrete example, in the post-war American sphere, you get a large number of philosophers, analytic philosophers, who work for the Rand Corporation. This has been known, for some time among specialists and sort of interested people, but it's really quite striking, and it surprised even me doing the research on this, just how many there were, and that they were really, central people like Quine, Davidson, Tarski, Reichenbach, who worked for Rand for varying lengths of time, and so they were very much drawn into figuring out things like, how to defeat the Soviet Union. Really quite directly, they were doing game theoretical calculations about how to get ahead in the race against the Soviet Union as the United States saw it. And so that's a huge sort of constraining influence on what gets done in philosophy. And it's very striking that, when political philosophy gets reborn in the analytic tradition, having been sort of, people thought completely killed off. This wasn't the case, but it had been really deadened. Gets reborn with publication of A Theory of Justice by John Rawls in 1971. That this book has this very, very long history going back to the 50s in terms of trying to think of political philosophy in game theoretical terms. So the foundations of political philosophy in game theoretical terms. So there you see, philosophers doing what they're doing very much in a particular context that's shaping what they're doing. But it's also true, of course, that these philosophy professors, as people who are operating in elite universities like Harvard and Yale and so on, they play quite a significant role then in sort of validating and upholding a certain set of kind of ideological commitments. So, for example, even just the commitment to a methodological individualism when it comes to thinking about normative issues, ethics and politics, it becomes sort of unquestioned or even unquestionable that you think in terms of human beings, each sort of one by one in terms of their individual preferences and interests, sort of going around in the world, and then we aggregate their preferences, or we try to decide between their preferences and so on. And philosophy there, I think, plays a more powerful role than professional philosophers, certainly. And I think the wider public tends to think, because there's this kind of way in which the fact that people in the philosophy department are validating and underwriting certain sort of methodological presuppositions really does actually do some work of solidifying and corroborating them when they're happening elsewhere. So, in economics departments, it's very difficult for people to be heterodox economists, not just because there are pressures from within the economics discipline, but because philosophers are kind of going around validating principles which are very closely connected to those of neoclassical economics. So the individualism and basically, as I would say, empiricistic outlook, which is not to say everyone's an empiricist. That would be kind of crazy thing to say about analytic philosophy, but a sort of basically empiricistic stance.
I've definitely noticed a big overlap between classical economics and sort of the well, I mean, maybe we'll talk about some of this stuff a bit later if we get around to it, about, you know, the governing hand in the free marketplace of ideas and things like that. But yeah, I can definitely see consequences of those ideas in, you know, like the Sam Bankman-Fried scandal thing, where he was like an effective altruist, and I don't mean to, I know effective altruists hate when people say, you know, therefore effective altruism bad because, you know, crypto scam or whatever, but just to say that I guess these ideas have been involved in events that have big legal consequences or billions of dollars involved and things like that. So the direction of explanation has to kind of go in both directions, I think. So there's a characterization you sort of give at the start of your book, where you touch on a few themes, I guess, that are present in analytic philosophy. As you've already said, whether or not these are essential characteristics or whether there is any particular, you know, thing that's common to all analytic philosophy, it doesn't seem that actually is so clear. But I guess these are a few themes that you talk about in terms of how it seems to be characterized. And actually, one of them that you mentioned, this one of whenever it's almost like this sort of snarky point scoring type locutions that sneak their way into your ways of thinking or communicating these ideas, that I've even noticed in myself and been trying to stop myself doing since reading this book, is when you disagree with something to say, you know, your idea is confused here or something, rather than saying, I think you're wrong and here's why, something like that, to say, you know, you're conceptually confused. And it's like some sort of putting yourself on a pedestal, and or, you know, it's a little bit questionable morally, that type of talk, I think. But yes, so some of the characteristics that you give, I can kind of raise them one by one if you want to give a little bit, just so you don't have to hold them all in your mind at the same time. So one of them is like that it's like a liberal movement. Do you want to explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so well, I suppose the most directly relevant thing about liberalism here is that it's an ideology that, well, first of all, it's very interesting because it's an ideology that often doesn't think of itself as an ideology, because people who are liberals in societies where liberalism is a dominant ideology don't really have to think about it, or there are good structural reasons not to think about the commitments of the ideology as being ideological. So one of the commitments that I think is most relevant here is the notion that human subjects, so the people that engage in philosophical debates or human subjects sort of more broadly, are sort of all on an equal footing in a certain sense. So there's a certain kind of egalitarianism that I think is key to liberalism, where the idea is, well, everyone's got their own sort of spontaneous agency, by which, if only this agency is exercised, they get to be equal participants with others who are similarly disposed, and that is in principle everyone. So this is reflected in a certain way of conducting philosophical discussions, where the idea is, well, anyone who wishes to is able to come in and sort of represent themselves and air their view and put their argument. I think in a very close analogy with the liberal conception of juridical procedure, right, where the idea is, well, if, you know, I have some cause for complaint or need for redress, I am empowered just as much as the next person to make my representations in a court of law, and what I then say will be adjudicated in a certain way according to certain principles. But basically, you know, I'm free to go and say my piece. Now, of course, I'm not really quite free to go and say my piece, because I'm only really free to do so insofar as it's formulated in the correct legal jargon and so on. So probably need a legal representative, and that's going to cost me a lot of money. And then it turns out, if I'm not a certain kind of person, socioeconomically, I actually won't have access to any of that. So I probably won't have my case heard, and I'll probably be disadvantaged in that legal system. So there's something about sort of normal procedures of analytic philosophy, I think, where there can be in the bad case, there's a sort of fantasy where anyone can speak and anyone can, you know, put their argument. And you very quickly see this unravel when it comes to people saying the wrong sorts of things or not in the right sort of way, where then the interlocutor will say, well, I just can't understand what you're saying. And that's a way of basically, you know, either ending the discussion or putting a huge wedge between the speakers. I think this is an interesting area to me because I often find myself in situations, sort of academic situations, where some of the people participating are more, you know, what we loosely call continental philosophers, and some of the people participating are from an analytic background, and they engage very differently. And sometimes I experience it as a kind of relief and a breath of fresh air when someone's an analytic philosopher, because they have this sort of attitude of, well, let's examine what you said. And let's try and keep track of exactly what your commitments are and what you think the entailments are that follow from your claims. And, you know, and stop me when we stop agreeing about that being your view. And there's usually a back and forth, and there's, you know, a sort of iterated discursive thing that goes on, as opposed to somebody giving a long exposition about, you know, something very interesting that they've thought, and then the other person giving their very long response, which is, I think, often philosophically less satisfying. So there's something about the kind of quasi-democratic notion of, well, anyone may sort of enter the sphere and say their thing. Something very attractive about that, but also something very deceptive, I think, just as there is with, you know, democracy as a political phenomenon.
Yeah, it's like if you're participating in that type of exchange, then you can sort of story tell that you're in this marketplace of ideas and it's a meritocracy, and all we're doing is evaluating the you know, whether or not we think certain propositions are true or false or something, and nothing else matters to that. And there's a sense in which that's part of what's going on, and there's a sense in which, you know, maybe there's selection effects on those ideas and all sorts of things in the background that can be questioned or challenged, and they wouldn't necessarily come up in even that form of debate or discussion that's being raised or something like that. Is that the general gist there?
Yeah. And certain ideas can be just, I suppose, absorbed in a way that's can be quite disturbing. So there's a way in which this is not specific to analytic philosophy, but I think it manifests it. If somebody wishes to enter a discussion as a critical, from a critical vantage point, where the interlocutor is just too keen to have that critical vantage point figure as just, you know, a position that one might adopt in the logical space or something like that, just sort of on all fours with all the others. And the person that's trying to make the critical intervention just can't really get anywhere. So it's a bit like, I don't want to push this too hard, but, you know, kind of corporate response when there's some cause for grievance.
Just what's come to my mind.
If you do this terrible thing, then the corporate response is, you know, we take your suffering very seriously. And when you hear that phrase, we take X, Y, Z very seriously, you know that you're not going to be taken seriously in the sense that you want to be taken seriously.
An example that just came in my mind as you were saying that is the Plantingan free will defense to the problem of evil. You know, it's logically possible that, you know, it's demons that cause hurricanes. So there's no logical problem of it. And it's just this, you know, technically correct, but completely unsatisfactory response. Sorry to interrupt. I just
No, that's fine. Yeah, it's I mean, it's interesting also that analytic philosophy itself, at a certain point, got quite far into questions about how conversations and discussions work, and some of that work, I think, is some of the most interesting work in analytic philosophy. But there's sort of further to go, and I think it's the political is the name for the place where it's got further to go.
And so one of the other characteristics that you give it is, or one of the characteristics that you say it has is a deference to science. And I wonder if you could unpack that, because I guess in my thinking, there are some positives to that, and then there's also some negatives to that. So, I mean, do you want to unpack what you mean by that there's a deference to science and what your kind of views are of whether that's a good or bad thing?
Yeah. So I think deference to science is one of the really interesting features. So it's something that I try to sort of trace, through the history and find it in different places. And I also link it back to David Hume. So the kind of main characteristics, I link them all back to David Hume, partly to sort of a bit make it evident to analytic philosophers that not only do they have a tradition, but it's a tradition that's really kind of anchored in 18th century ideas in a quite significant way. And that ought to seem very surprising, I think. Although it wasn't surprising to certain people like Russell and H.H. Price, who wrote about this, and other people. But deference to science, I think, is one of the more interesting ones, because it can take different forms, which are actually quite contrasting, have very different effects. So one way in which you find deference to science, and a bit of a sort of echo in a way of Hume saying, Hume says something like he wants to be the Newton of the mind, right? He wants to do for the mind what Newton and Boyle did for nature. In Russell, who talks about his own work in philosophy as being, or aspiring to be, itself scientific. So Russell is interesting to me because he's in so many ways, I think, the most ambitious, intellectually ambitious of really all of the people that I talk about in the book. And something that I think makes Russell admirable in many ways. But Russell had this idea, he had this phrase, right, the logical analytical method, which was this program in philosophy, and he was going to execute it. It's not clear that he ever managed to execute it. Seems to me that he didn't. But the idea there is, in philosophy itself, is going to enter this new era in which it becomes like a science. And that's very different from the kind of conception that you get among the logical positivists, the Vienna Circle people, because they're experiencing the same kind of great set of revolutions in science that's motivating Russell, so in particular the work of Einstein, which is just creates kind of seismic effect in the understanding of science among practicing scientists, and makes them really think about the foundations of science. And there's this phrase in the 1890s before that goes around the crisis of the sciences. Everyone thought there was a crisis of the sciences at the same time that they were breaking all these boundaries constantly. And the Vienna Circle, I think, much more think, partly because they're themselves generally practicing scientists, which is worth remembering. Moritz Schlick, who is the leader of the Vienna Circle, was a student of a man called Max Planck, right? So he was a physicist by training, had a PhD in physics. They just sort of took it that respectable inquiry, rational inquiry, had to have empirical methods. Right? So it had to be a question of testable phenomena being inputted into a theory that then had a certain kind of predictive power to sort of output predictions about such similarly testable phenomena. I've said testable as a kind of weasel word to avoid talking about verification, which is a technical issue that they struggle with. But there's this sense of deference to science, which is something like, well, we already know that the sciences are great, and now we must find a place for philosophy that does justice to the fact, right, that science is the way in which to proceed in rational inquiry. I think an indicator of that is that the Vienna Circle was contrary to what one might think. Parts of the Vienna Circle, anyway, certainly Neurath and I think also Carnap, were very sympathetic to Freud, because they thought Freud was perfectly respectable and scientific. There are problems with the way Freud expresses himself, because he uses metaphysical formulations. But the idea was you could translate Freud into appropriate, empirically respectable language, and then it would be fine. So they sort of have this image of what it is for something to be scientific, and then philosophy must find its place as something like the handmaid into the sciences. So this view is like, it's taken in a very exaggerated direction by A.J. Ayer in Language, Truth and Logic, which is the picture of the logical positivists that I think a lot of people have grown up on. But it's there in some form among all these people. It's not a million miles actually from, I hadn't thought about this, but just as I'm talking to you now about it, Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason says things like, well, we know that mathematics works, we know geometry works, and we could then retrace the conditions of possibility of those things. And his project is then to put metaphysics on a similar kind of footing. But there's a similar kind of notion, well, we know that the sciences are kosher, and now philosophy has to measure up in some way, it has to find a place. So those things sound very different, I think, from each other.
Yeah, it sounds to me like what you're describing there as well is, because I think maybe a part of my concern here is like this idea maybe that some people have who do philosophy, that they can then sort of like almost undermine what the scientists have to say about the world, or like, even on their own terms, they can like figure it out better than them by some like tools of philosophy or something. And I think that maybe one of my criticisms of even analytic philosophy would be that often, or all too often, philosophers are making these kind of like theories with these claims in them that are actually just typically, or not typically, but very often empirically false, right? In some science that they're just unaware of. And so, I'd say philosophers should be as aware as they can be, particularly when they're philosophizing about things that are very close to what scientists are doing, or to make disambiguations between what scientific claims are saying versus what they're trying to say if they seem to conflict. But then it sounds like what you're saying is almost slightly different, which is like this tendency to try to borrow the legitimacy of the sciences by adopting their methodology or notation, something like that. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Is that,
Well, I'm thinking, I guess, that Russell is someone who's susceptible to that charge of sort of trying to get the reflective glow of the sciences to reflect back on his philosophy or something like that. I don't think it's true of the Vienna Circle people, because I think they're incredibly scrupulous about this. I think that they think, well, the respectability of the sciences is derived only from the sciences themselves, and they're very principled and reflective about these questions like, well, what underwrites the validity of the sciences? Is that on the basis of some empirical set of observations? And so there's a kind of revisability even to the, I think they recognize that to ascribe such status to the sciences is itself a claim that's susceptible to some kind of revisability that makes it different from traditional metaphysics, and they're quite clever about that. But I mean, what interests me in what you were just saying about philosophers sort of trying to contest what sciences say is that there is something that happens, which is where philosophy comes into conflict with science. Often then there is a retreat to common sense, which is then kind of the next characteristics that I draw out. Where so the common sense is this kind of refuge where you can go when other things fail and you can't get your philosophy to measure up to the sciences, and that then becomes a kind of in some cases really a fetish. I think is not too much to say. So there's a really interesting discussion which I don't know if you've seen. It's on YouTube somewhere. It's an old probably BBC sort of educational program, maybe an Open University thing, something like that, which is a discussion between the philosopher Bernard Williams and the physicist Dennis Sharma about time.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
Okay, I recommend it, and also to your viewers, because there's a bit in it where Sharma starts to get really quite excited about the strangeness of time as physicists conceive of it, which Sharma, of course, presents as a set of physical discoveries. And Williams is then sort of put onto the back foot, because Williams' main concern is to sort of, as he will put it, get the scientific conception of time sort of into line with his common sense conception. And Sharma just has no interest in this and no time for it. He says, well, your common sense conception is just wrong. And Williams will keep saying things like, but what you're saying about if I spin around the Earth really, 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 really fast, that somehow that will have some effect on how much time it takes to go. It just doesn't seem right to me. It's my common sense conception of time. And Sharma just says, well, never mind your common sense conception of time. And that's a place where you see this in somebody very, very sophisticated like Williams. You see this kind of commitment really, really come out that, well, the common sense notion has to be respected in a context where, as you're watching the exchange between these people, you start to think, but why are you so wedded to this? And it's not completely unintelligible why Williams is so wedded to it. And it raises this very interesting question. I mean, could we actually think of time in the way that physicists propose that we should think of time? Because it's not clear that we can. So it's an interesting place where this frictionness really, really comes out.
Yeah. I don't mean to open up all of these issues. It's hard to talk about these issues without kind of getting into them. I definitely see what do I want to say that's not going to bring up the issue too much. Maybe something like I think something that comes out in your book a little bit is how in some of these movements that are, as you say, fetishizing common sense, how also the type of common sense that they're fetishizing, it's not that they're necessarily defending, even if they might use the word ordinary people and their conceptions and way of life from sort of, I don't know, people in the sciences coming along and telling them that, they can't love each other because it's not a theoretical primitive or something like that, to a really super crude caricature. But maybe more it's sometimes that what they're defending as common sense is not empirically driven. It's actually, the common sense of the Oxford seminar room or whatever, or something like that as well.
It's not empirically driven at all. This is really striking. And Williams actually publishes this review of a book by Geoffrey Warnock back in the 50s, where Warnock's going on and on and on about common sense. And Williams makes this very cutting point that, well, I mean, you're the one determining what common sense is here. And actually people have had these very sophisticated conceptions of things like free will, going way back, or substance or whatever. And it's interesting what happens when you do it empirically, which is something that has happened, right? So it's really jumping ahead maybe to what you want to talk about. But
it's okay though, because I can kind of reorder things as they come up or whatever, so it's all good. Yeah.
Okay. So experimental philosophy, which is a very recent phenomenon within analytic philosophy. So philosophers actually going out into the street and asking people what they think about certain fundamental philosophical questions. That's been really interesting because part of what experimental philosophers have found is that people have very sophisticated, sometimes very bizarre, but bizarre and sophisticated can go together, or sometimes just very sophisticated because very well thought out positions on, for example, metaphysical issues. So if you ask people, do you think there's a distinction between how things appear and how they really are? You'll get really interesting answers. And that completely goes against, what philosophers to take the extreme case, philosophers in Oxford in the 1950s were talking about when they were emphasizing common sense in the way that they were. Because part of their conception of what the ordinary person thinks is that the ordinary person believes in something called direct realism, which is very difficult to characterize view, I think, but it's something like, well, the things that there are in the world are just the things that we take there to be, tables, chairs, and then, go on from there. and our experience of them is in some sense direct, which is a word you should always be wary of when philosophers use it. But somehow it's all more obvious and more commonsensical in some kind of Oxford educated way than you might suppose if you started reading, Descartes or Kant or these people with those very sophisticated views.
And one of the other characteristics in there that's very closely related to common sense is sort of a reliance on intuitions, or or one of the, I don't know if this has much history to it, but at least one of the ways I see people talking about it now is like intellectual seemings. And I don't know if you want to just briefly outline how that is characteristic of analytic philosophy, maybe versus other traditions.
Yes, I think the reliance on intuitions as the sort of beginning points of philosophical arguments, I think is extremely characteristic of what you might call late analytic philosophy. So what we've had maybe since the 70s, or certainly since the 80s. And you get it in different areas. So one area where it appears is metaphysics, and another area where it appears is ethics. And they have quite a lot in common, but there are also differences. So in metaphysics, metaphysics, there's this very strange, fascinating situation in the 1970s where metaphysical questions, metaphysical inquiry came back into analytic philosophy, largely because of a set of technical developments that made it possible to give logical characterizations of different things, different ways the world is, may be, or has to be. And there was then the sort of technical apparatus for thinking about those things, which, and sooner or later philosophers were going to ask themselves the question, but, how does all of this work out substantively, rather than just in terms of systems that can be constructed in technical terms? And so philosophers found themselves sort of embroiled in these questions again that had been outlawed before about, what properties a thing has essentially, for example. The thing that Quine most feared, that anyone would start talking in this way again, and it happened. But there's a difficulty with this, which is that analytic philosophers of this generation, and with the background that they had, didn't really have any means they didn't have anything to rest their metaphysical speculations on, other than ultimately, in the end, well, when I consult my intuitions, it seems that the right thing to say is that one particular kind of claim about what's essential entails another kind of claim about what's essential. And so you get a really remarkable thing, which is philosophers who claim to be, and you see this if you read the prefaces to some of these books in metaphysics, so people like Theodore Sider, for example, they'll say, no, my method is basically to consult common sense ultimately, and then if it conflicts a lot with science, then I'll rethink maybe, but there's this place for common sense. And the role that common sense is playing is it's adjudicating a metaphysical question, which is how to cut nature at its joints. So this phrase that comes originally from Plato, which means determine the actual structure of reality. How is reality itself constituted? Which seems, to somebody with some education in post-Kantian philosophy, so Kant and people like Hegel, it seems sort of scandalous that you could quite openly say that you're carving nature at its joints, or attempting to carve nature at its joints by relying on intuitions. In ethics, you get something which is in a sense similar. So the appeal to intuitions is often associated with using thought experiments as a way to determine ethical truth. So you take some kind of constructed ethical scenario, like the famous trolley problem, right? So you're on a train, it's headed straight ahead and it's going to kill 5 people, but you see a track off to the right, which has got 1 person on it. You know that each way you go, it'll be fatal to the people that are there. Is it permissible to turn the trolley train so that you kill 1 instead of killing 5? And then the idea is, there are all sorts of different ways intuitions are used, right? But one is that we use how we intuitively respond to different cases. So if we vary various parameters to determine what we actually think the ethical truth is. So again, there's a similar problem of what is the status of these intuitions and what has gone into producing them. There's a great discussion, which I maybe touch on in a footnote somewhere, refer to it obliquely, but by Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks, where he talks about common sense. And he says, he takes it as very obvious that common sense is largely constituted by how people are brought up, in particular things like religious upbringing, which feed massively into what people think is evident or obvious and so on, right? But that's not ever examined. And I think this is a very sweeping claim, but I think it's true. I don't think it's ever examined by the people who engage in such reliance on intuition. Sometimes intuition pumping, which is a term for sort of finding out what your intuitions are when faced with certain cases. Because of course, as soon as you start to do that, you then veer off into a different kind of conception of ethical inquiry. So somebody who raises very deep questions about this sort of approach is Cora Diamond, who's a broadly Wittgensteinian philosopher. And she makes this very, very profound point, I think, about ethics, which is, she says, but it's precisely true of ethics if you think about who the people are in the world who are good ethically, who handle challenging situations well, where there's a pressure on deciding how to act, and it's really difficult to determine how to act, and how you act has really serious consequences. If you look at those people who do that kind of thing well, they're not people that are just sort of calculating how a particular scenario is supposed to be understood, and then sort of intuitions sort of coming into play. It's that they actually have this kind of immense imaginative capacity. So they're highly responsive to the specifics of the situation. So I think, if once you're onto that sort of insight, then the idea that what you should be doing in ethics is like setting up all these sort of abstract very schematic thought experiments, and then seeing how we just anyway feel about them. It doesn't tell you anything ethically interesting. It might tell you something anthropologically interesting, but then only about a very small group of people, which is the people who take philosophy courses in broadly Anglophone institutions, or maybe Germany and Scandinavia, but it's very limited.
Yeah, my friend Lance actually does a lot of his work in experimental philosophy of metaethics, and it drives him insane because he has these conversations with people, and they pretty much always terminate in the same sorts of places of these kind of intuition claims of, either people will use like collective pronouns, so they say, like, well, we wouldn't want to say, or and anyone would say XYZ, or it will depend on these like normative entanglement intuitions between, you get one of these cases like, well, obviously murdering babies for fun is wrong, and it's intuitive to me, and that's a stance independent moral fact, even though like the meta-ethical theory, it would be perfectly consistent for someone who's a moral anti-realist, for example, to endorse that murdering babies for fun is obviously wrong. They just would have a different like semantic analysis or something of what's going on. And so, you know, like these moves that are made by people using intuitions and this kind of like that incredibly frustrating, I think, to engage with. It's not clear that they track truth, but they're so. The other thing is that they're so like sort of self-sealing, because how do you challenge an intuition someone has if they don't want to? Like, I feel for anything I would say I have an intuition of, I'm more than open to someone sort of like deconstructing that in some way, you know, like saying, well, isn't it like weird that you use that word, but that word is only 50 years old? And I'd be like, yeah, it's curious that I'm saying I've got an intuition, or like, you know, that's a very specific theory in the sciences or something. So why am I just taking it for granted in that way or something? Whereas for other people, yeah, go ahead.
But one thing you touched on, which is the use of the word "we" itself, I think it's very interesting.
Yes, yeah.
Because it signals a real ignorance of a whole set of questions about, you know, the nature of the social, and in particular about, I mean, to put it in slightly Marxist terms, in particular about class, right? The idea that there is just a we, that philosophers, as the authors of their papers, can just wield. And I mean, one of the things to notice immediately is that when people say we in philosophy papers, they basically mean two things at once, which is, you know, all of humanity, but also just the sorts of people who read this kind of paper. So basically philosophy's, you know, advanced philosophy students and faculty, because it's sort of known that actually no one else reads these things. So that slide is facilitated by this kind of sociological fact. But the tendency to elide that distinction itself, like the distinction between just universal humanity and philosophy academics, is a really worrying thing, because you would want philosophers to be sort of people that were very reflective about precisely that sort of thing, right? Like who am I actually addressing, and who's included in this first person plural?
Yeah, that's one of the things that often comes up, is because, you know, I suppose one of the proposals for what's going on there is this idea that a lot of these intuitions or ways of talking are things people are being trained into in the philosophy seminar room. But, you know, philosophers are taking themselves to be the very sort of people who are supposed to be carefully, you know, thinking these things through and being very cautious to the details. But then they find themselves inducted into these, you know, intractable discourses that it's not even clear what the problem even is that's at stake. But, you know, you've got the pro-isms and the anti-isms and which camp do you fall in, and here are the problems, and all that sort of stuff. And the basis for such disputes is going to be, you know, some intuition pump and about a term that may not be a very neutral term, or whether it's even a problem that exists in the first place, and intuitions that fall in one camp or the other camp, right? And yeah, it's very, very frustrating if you don't see all of that as legitimate.
Yeah, and this question of not knowing what the problem is, I think, is also really, really crucial. And that's a sort of, I think, largely post late 1940s phenomenon in analytic philosophy, because if you look at earlier people who I would call kind of proto-analytic, but that's just my way of carving things up, I don't think you find it in the same way. But there's a sort of tendency after a certain period to just take it as read that there are certain problems. Like, I don't know, somebody might ask the question, is anger a mental state? And if you were a little bit outside of philosophy as it's practiced in the academy, you might think, what's this person about? What are they?
Yeah, what are you even saying? Like,
what is the inquiry to which you're trying to contribute here? Because it can't just be, you know, is this word a nice label that we're happy to use, because that's relatively easy to answer, and doesn't really matter. And people will have disagreements about that, which are kind of faultless disagreements. So you get to this place where we don't really know what it is that we're doing. Now I've used we, sort of slightly ironically. so it starts to feel like just sort of certain procedures are just being deployed. So you see in philosophy seminars, often people say it's important to draw a distinction between, and then you hope it's two things, but it might be many more.
Internalism and externalism.
Draw a distinction. What is the distinction? Distinctions can be very important because they could serve an important function, even for example in natural science. But you want to know why we're doing it, and it can feel like we're drawing distinctions because drawing distinctions is a thing we do, and we like doing it, and we're good at doing that. We don't know how to stake out a philosophical problem, but we do know how to insist on differences between the meanings of different words, or ways in which one word can mean different things, and then it starts to look like sort of the worst excesses of linguistic philosophy that used to be satirized by British comedians in the past. So you can see why.
So I guess there's quite a lot to get through. I'm just thinking about like time constraints. I don't think we'll get through all the questions. Maybe we can get some of the way, and then whenever we get to a point that it's natural to stop off, we can think if you want to do something again, picking off and going through the rest or something. So at the point then where I'm at in sort of the questions that I've got, there was one thing that came up as well in after your characterization of like analytic philosophy, which was like oh, and I've spelled it wrong. Let me add in the correct spelling, unless you're American. And yeah, you kind of briefly raised like behaviorism in psychology. And I think maybe there's like a criticism in there that maybe this view is like too reductive or misses important things. Or do you want to put in your own terms what the kind of criticism is or was?
Yeah, so behaviorism is interesting because it was very stridently defended by people in psychology, which is where it originated, for a while. And then Noam Chomsky wrote a review of a book by B.F. Skinner, which was universally considered to sort of just have killed off behaviorism. And of course, it wasn't just Chomsky's review that did that, but there was an environment in which Chomsky's review could be experienced as doing that. So sorry, as you rightly asked me, I should say roughly what behaviorism is. So there's this aspiration in psychology. So it's articulated by this guy Watson, who came up with the term behaviorism. It's aspiration to get rid of basically all of the traditional furniture of psychology. So one of the concepts that he really hated was consciousness. And he says we should dispense with this concept. It doesn't really do any scientific work. And so what behaviorists try to do is they try to study human mental life, sometimes mental life of other animals too, in terms of purely the inputs and outputs of behavior, or stimulus and response, basically. That's a kind of wonderful idea, right? Because the idea is you don't have to wonder about sort of what goes on inside. You just look at the ways in which an organism is affected, and then you look at the way in which the organism reacts. And that will then be a kind of scientific account of its entire mental life. Often also associated with the idea that organisms are conditioned, or can be conditioned by stimuli in a very, very far-reaching way. And that's, if that were true, that would be very convenient for behaviorists, because it would suggest that the question of what's going on inside matters sort of in almost no way at all, because it's like there isn't anything inside. So then there was a big problem, which was that you could condition, for example, primates to exhibit various kinds of behaviors, but at a certain point they would just stop doing them, and they would revert to what was then inevitably often described as innate behaviors. Yeah, those things in principle come apart, right? The idea, this kind of substantive thesis about how nothing or not much is innate, and then the idea that, well, the scientific way to do psychology would be in a behavioristic way. And it's notable that behaviorism, having been embraced by a certain kind of intellectuals, especially philosophers, for quite a while, because it just gets killed very quickly after. I think it's 1959 that Chomsky writes this review. After that, nobody wants to be a behaviorist anymore. But there's, I think, an interesting sense, and I haven't investigated this much and like to sort of think about it more, but I think there's a sense in which this kind of notion that, well, all that matters is stimulus and response, or input and output, is something that continues to sort of capture the minds of analytic philosophers. So there's a notion that computers might be functionally equivalent to minds, which has a similar kind of flavor to it in the way in which it's sometimes been adopted. So I think it probably has more of a kind of afterlife than it would seem to. But I mean, the most obvious thing about behaviorism is that, unlike neoclassical economics, it didn't manage to reinvent itself. It didn't manage to somehow just keep going. And neoclassical economics has. So I describe neoclassical economics and behaviorism as kind of cousins of analytic philosophy, largely because of the way in which they sort of arise together in a certain US environment.
So just to make sure, so the parallel or the point in raising it isn't to necessarily say, obviously, that there's some relationship between some philosophers and some things in behaviorism or whatever, but it's more to say, here's like an example of a particular kind of like research program in a discipline that can be looked at that has a similar flavor in many respects, and here's how it kind of ended up going away because it was seen that some aspects of it were too limiting or something like that, and it's to draw an analogy between that and the way you see analytic philosophy. Maybe is that kind of right?
Yeah, okay. And I think maybe a thing to add is that it's interesting to look at the response to the failure of behaviorism among analytic philosophers, and one way to do that is to contrast analytic philosophy with European philosophical traditions. So if you were educated in Paris, and you'd been somewhat amenable to behaviorist program, probably the place that you would next go would be phenomenology. You would go to kind of philosophy that placed a lot of emphasis on the nature of subjectivity and the idea to study mental phenomena in a very different sort of putatively scientific way. But you don't get that in analytic philosophy at all. Right, you get just there's just a sort of void where behaviorism used to be, and the development of philosophy of mind doesn't really, it doesn't go in the direction of providing sort of ever richer explorations of human subjectivity. It goes in a whole series of other directions, which are interesting because influenced by Wittgenstein and lots of complicated questions there. But what you don't get is a sense, well, behaviorism failed, so maybe what we need to do is actually do justice to the richness of inner experience, which is the precise thing that behaviorism was denying.
In terms of that sort of like vacuum that you say is left, I don't know, the jokey sentence that came up within me was, cognitions cover a multitude of sins. And I think it would be very interesting to look within analytic philosophy at the ways that phrases or terms like cognitive content or like positions like cognitivism get scoped out as substantive positions, but may actually just be more sort of blank checks for things that are taken for granted very much maybe within analytic philosophy and the way certain things get thought about. But yeah, I guess maybe one of the things I found interesting about the behaviorism side is it's that thing you mentioned politically, where I guess if and I think this could potentially be a mischaracterization of what you're getting at, but if the idea was that it's overly reductive or removes certain aspects of human experience, I mean, maybe there's a couple of things that, I mean, obviously there's a lot of people who behaviorists would think about things differently, but I think there's maybe a few behaviorists would say, well, I mean, that's because there are limits to scientific inquiry. So this is where, you know, the science of human psychology, what the science of human psychology can do, but that's not to say anything about a bunch of this other stuff that just is, you know, it's impervious to scientific inquiry. And then maybe the other side of that would be to say, like, politically, something like, you know, something like you mentioned before, that it can be quite optimistic. I believe B.F. Skinner wrote a fiction book called like Walden 2 or something about, you know, a utopian future within which, you know, because human psychology was so understood, everyone was able to be sort of reshaped in these ways where they weren't beholden to, you know, all of these inequalities and injustices of luck. And that is also not to put aside that behaviorism also obviously was believed by many very horrible people who did unethical things and things like that as well. But just maybe there's also, I don't know if you think there's a positive side to, well, I mean, not that you deny the history, but if you think, you know, that there's a view to it that might be more positive also.
Yeah, I think Skinner had some pretty odd political views.
Oh, I don't know about them. You'll have to tell me.
Yeah.
Was he like a eugenicist or something? Is it, you know?
I think he was going in that direction. Yeah. From what I don't want to.
Okay.
I don't want to claim anything too specific because I don't know the text at first hand, but I think, yeah, the stuff in Skinner about sort of the possibilities of transformation can go in a strange direction at times. But be that as it may, right? It's still there's still a place for people who say something like, well, psychology has its scope, and its scope is limited, right, by the truth of behaviorism as they see it, and that's not to deny the richness of human experience, but it's just doesn't fall within the scope of science, and that does seem to me a relatively respectable view, and it makes it sound more like what people like, for example, the logical positivists are doing, which I think is in many ways a respectable view, because it's I don't agree with it, but I think you know, someone like Neurath, when he talks about the unity of science, and he's got this project of all of this inquiry that's going to come together and this, be united with a social program, and this is the only game in town. We can't do metaphysics and so on. Where there's a kind of principled defense of that position, that I have quite a bit of time for. But I think there is quite a lot of, if I got you right, what you were talking about with, you know, all the sorts of things that cognition might mean, where there's this sort of slide into actually quite substantive philosophical theory that's just kind of ultimately empty on the inside, and that I think is quite worrying.
Yeah, I think my view of what the more thoughtful behaviorists were doing, at least, and I actually very recently I've just been like trying to learn about some of this stuff, and a lot of them seem quite interested in particularly the operationalism of the Vienna Circle, because they're like, look, if we're going to have a real science here, we want to operationalize what we mean by these terms, and then we can have empirical, you know, inquiry into what's going on and study that. And yeah, I think that at least as far as psychology goes, you know, there's this real emphasis on method and observation and good method within the behaviorist research program, that I think and I think you can characterize, at least in psychology, the cognitive revolution as not only being a movement away from that, but introducing a lot of, I mean, this is going to sound very pejorative, I've had to substantiate it, but quite a lot of like sloppiness, I guess, with regard to computational metaphor information, which, I mean, I would explain as being shaped by the economic forces and funding incentives and things like that at the time within the university system. And yeah, a lot of that stuff can cover a litany of sins, maybe, where behaviorists are very focused on trying to empirically operationalize things, because cognitions are unobservables. You can just postulate a cognition for free. You can find some statistical effect and then postulate a cognition that sits in between, because you don't have to study causal mechanism. And I actually even think that that's then responsible for a lot of the replication crisis stuff that comes about in psychology later on. But that's a whole kind of worms. I don't have to say much more about all that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
So the next thing then that you go on to is British idealism within, which is like, I guess, a really strong sort of program within British universities, how philosophy is being studied, and the very opposite of behaviorism. Everything is phenomenally mental, maybe, depending on whose idealism you're talking about. And I guess a lot of the people who will go on to become the prominent in the story of analytic philosophy, the prominent founding figures, they're doing so in reaction to British idealism. So do you want to kind of just paint the picture of what is that idealism, and how is that shaping a reaction to it that's going to come about?
Yeah, it's curious actually about British idealism, that it's true in some sense it was a movement, particularly strong in Oxford in the late 19th century. But it's, I think, often seen in a slightly misleading way as being the sort of great monolithic movement, and particularly as if it really dominated British philosophy, where if dominated means something like more or less obliterated everything else. Because that's really not the case in the place where the principal reaction that you're talking about happens, which is Cambridge. So Russell and Moore both perform what they call or carry out a rebellion against idealism, which happens in 1898, when they're still very young men, recently got their undergraduate degrees in Cambridge, reacting against a set of philosophical views that they had themselves only very recently adopted, under the influence, partly sort of direct influence, of a man called John MacTaggart, Ellis MacTaggart, who was a don at Cambridge. He was one of the 4 people that taught philosophy. It was incredibly small, and was only actually a few years older than they were, which is, I hadn't really realized this before, but he was maybe, I don't know, 29, and they were in their
okay, interesting,
or even younger, and they were 18 to 22-year-olds when they were doing all this. And MacTaggart had very specific, he was really a Hegelian in a much stronger sense than some of the Oxford British idealists were. That's to say, he was very close to Hegel's own texts, and really saw himself as a Hegelian. And both Moore and Russell were enormously impressed by him, and had sort of flirted with idealism. And then the other big figure that they react against is F.H. Bradley, who is the main idealist in a certain sense in Oxford, although he never really set foot in Oxford. But they're reading Bradley's work. And I mean, a curious feature of what they do with Bradley is that Bradley is largely motivated by a critique of empiricism. So to the effect that, well, I suppose the critique is sort of driven by the problem of what's sometimes called the veil of perception. So how does it we get across from our subjective experience to there being really things in the world? And Bradley has an idealist theory of judgment to deal with this. And in response to that, Moore, who's the person who leads the rebellion, and Russell always acknowledged Moore as the person who philosophically led it. So it develops this idealist critique of empiricism, that it takes it through another turn, so to speak. And so it remains, Moore's view remains actually critical of empiricism, But the idea is that there's actually kind of no gap between judgments, so our thoughts, and what they're judgments of, because the world itself is constituted by concepts sort of configured together in particular ways to make propositions. And Moore really held this view that the world's made up of concepts, or what Russell would call terms. So really, strikingly bizarre view. And that lays in some ways the beginnings, sort of the foundations of analytic philosophy, and becomes particularly potent when Russell starts to discover mathematical logic, which he had never known anything about because he'd studied mathematics in Cambridge, but mathematics in Cambridge in this period was way, way behind what was happening in Germany. So Russell didn't know anything about Cantor and Dedekind and the Weierstrass and these important German mathematicians until he went to America and discovered, spoke to mathematicians there who knew this stuff, and then went back and then sort of by chance gets into mathematical logic by talking to a man called Louis Couturat, who was writing a book on Leibniz in Paris. And Russell just so happened to write a book on Leibniz because he had to give some lectures on Leibniz while McTaggart was off in New Zealand chasing a woman that he was interested in, who he then brought back with him and married. Anyway, McTaggart was supposed to teach Leibniz. Russell ends up doing this, so Russell being Russell then just turns this into a book, and Couturat reviews it, and they then discover that they're both interested in the same project, or similar project, which is so-called logicism, right? The attempt to derive all of mathematics from logic.
And just to ask, is Russell aware of Frege's work at all at this point, or is this before or after? No, okay.
Aware in the sense that one of the four people at Cambridge, who's a man called James Ward, who was, in a sense, principally a psychologist, who was a very highly educated person who'd spent time in Germany studying philosophy there and psychology, had come across Frege and had given Russell a copy of Begriffsschrift, which is Frege's masterpiece, which Russell had no idea what to do with. It was complete gobbledygook to him, very understandably. And it's then through Couturat that he's invited to come and talk at the first International Congress of Philosophy in Paris in 1900. And there he goes to a talk by a man called Giuseppe Peano, who gives a talk on mathematical logic. And Russell's completely blown away by this. And he writes home things like, the logical notation of Peano is going to produce a new revolution in philosophy akin to the ancient Greeks and all this kind of thing. And it's because of, then he gets hold of all of Peano's writings and he starts reading Frege seriously. So Frege comes in there, and Russell has this peculiar way of sort of uniting what one historian calls Platonic atomism, which is Moore's early view, this kind of anti-empiricist but no longer idealist thing, with mathematical logic. So there's a very specific set of developments through which that bit of analytic or proto-analytic philosophy gets going.
And just to
say, I mean, British idealism is a kind of backdrop to this, but I think Moore and Russell really exaggerated. There was this sort of in Russell's autobiographical writings, of which there were many, because he was always trying to make sense of himself. There's this sort of implication that Hegelianism was this terrible sort of monster that was trying to devour them, but I think it's slightly exaggerated.
Yeah, perhaps the present King of France is wearing a wig. The in his psychology, constantly in the background, I guess, this looming specter of German philosophy or something. Do you think it's too much of a stretch to say that fusion of those ideas, of that conceptualism of Moore and the kind of logical innovations of Russell sort of combined together, is what comes to fruition in Wittgenstein's Tractarian sort of views? Do you think that is sort of just a version of those two ideas fused together in terms of how he's thinking about metaphysics as, you know, the facts that hang together in a particular kind of logical space or whatever.
It's certainly the ancestry of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Whether it's, you know, I wouldn't want to say it's just the outcome of, you know, putting Moore and Russell together. And I think it's more Russell that's important for Wittgenstein, but certainly, yeah, there's a very interesting trajectory that you could trace through.
And so, okay, in terms of, let me know, by the way, because I'm very happy to like pause this and we can start again, but I think I'll probably look at a hard cutoff at least in like 20 minutes time or something. And then, yeah. So yeah, in terms of where we're at then, Russell is developing various like logical programs. He's adopting the notation of Frege. He gets kind of obsessed with certain problems like definite descriptions and things like that, or problems in philosophy of mathematics. At what point is this? And if you don't mind leaving out as much as you can about Frege for the linguistic turn part that you talk about in a separate chapter, you know, at what point is Russell's kind of ideas being more broadly adopted or having an influence, particularly with respect to the kind of like logical notation that's being developed and a particular kind of analysis of philosophical problems that's being given?
I think in terms of innovations in logic, Russell's contribution is absolutely seismic in its influence. And of course, not to forget Alfred North Whitehead, with whom he collaborates to write Principia Mathematica. So, I mean, without Russell and Whitehead, you know, no Vienna Circle, I mean, no logical positivism. They might have become neo-positivists of a quite different kind, but the logical part. And basically everybody who's anybody in logic is either taking on key Russellian ideas, Russellian methods, certainly the notation, and even those who are not developing Russell's program in any recognizable way are responding to it. So somebody to cite over in America, C.I. Lewis, who had been a student of the idealist philosopher Josiah Royce and got to work as his teaching assistant and was teaching a course on logic. And it was at the exact time that Principia Mathematica came out, first volume of Principia. And you know, Lewis had various ideas about what was difficult about Russell's approach before that, and was highly critical in some ways. What you see after the publication of Principia is that Lewis is able to formulate his objections much more precisely because he can wield the notation. So there's an advance in even critics of Russell do better as a result of Russell.
I mean, from your vantage point as the historian, I guess, do you think it is an advance? Just and I don't mean that in the sense of like that no one had these ideas before or whatever, but I think that analytic people who are more sympathetic to the analytic tradition will say, and now our ability to express what we're saying in this particular kind of way and have our disagreements in this way is progress. I mean, do you see there as being upsides to that, and are there any like downsides that people might kind of miss in terms of what's going on?
I think enormous upsides. I mean, the progress in logic that Russell more than anyone made possible. Well, I shouldn't say more than anyone, because I'll keep Frege out of it, but let him be there in the background. That's, I think, indisputable. I mean, there are questions about what the significance of those logical innovations are supposed to be beyond logic. And then philosophers are bound to ask sort of in other parts of philosophy, or in parts of philosophy, if you think logic isn't part of philosophy. And there are reasons to be very skeptical, but I think it's more because people are sloppy rather than that they have some kind of in principle, wrong approach. I mean, I just mean sloppy in the sense that it's often said that the sheer availability of logical techniques and people's mastery of them makes them better at things like reasoning, for example. And so the fact that there are the powerful logical tools that Russell and others developed is just better for everyone in philosophy and maybe even beyond it. I don't think that there's much evidence for that. So I think, but that's people choosing, I think, to often for sort of commercial reasons, right? They like to present the idea that, well, we have these powerful tools, and so we can think better. But I mean, if anything, the use of logical notation in philosophy papers, if you just took a completely statistical approach, probably majority of it is unhelpful. I would venture to say, just unhelpful because unnecessary.
And then just in terms of Moore's contribution, I guess in the book, I think it kind of comes out. Is it right? Would it be right to say that your view is that you think he's maybe he's not credited with as much of an impact as you think he may have had on philosophy in that period? Like he kind of, he's second fiddle to Russell in many senses.
I think that's what I would say. Yeah, just because I think Moore's contribution, I think is underrated. I think it's very easy to say it's underrated just because of how huge his contribution was. And what I mean by contribution is principally how he influenced how philosophy was actually done in Cambridge. So, Russell had much less of an influence in that sense, because after the First World War, during which he behaved in a way that the establishment couldn't accept. And by the way, McTaggart was one of the people that was responsible for him being removed from his fellowship at Trinity College. And after the First World War, he goes into this mode of the public intellectual, and he has stints where he's living in Cambridge and teaching there, but mostly he's not there. Whereas Moore is the principal figure, and he's the professor of philosophy, or one of the two professors of philosophy there. And Moore really, really shapes the way, in particular, philosophical discussion is carried out, which is, I think, difficult to appreciate in retrospect because it's become so entrenched, certainly in the British strands of analytic philosophy. The kind of the wielding of these questions, like, what exactly do you mean? This is extremely.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a good point, actually. So there are several points at which I wanted to. I wanted at the end to go through. There was like one critical review someone sent me of the book and said, "Oh, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this critical review." And this is one of the objections in that review. So maybe if I just raise specifically that question from the review, and obviously there will be more chance to talk about other things within that. And it's this Los Angeles Review of Books thing. And it was this bit where he says he accuses you of making fun of analytic philosophers for asking with an air of superiority. Now, what exactly do you mean by that? He said, this practice was alive and well in Oxford, he bemoans, as late as 2007. And then the author says, I'm sorry to say that requests for clarification are still a thing in analytic circles, and that I'm about to issue one. What exactly does Schuringa mean when he says that he's engaged in ideology critique of analytic philosophy? We can talk about that separately. But I guess the first thing is, on this Moorean point that you're raising, where the history associates to Moore of this way of talking. I mean, what's implied here, I guess, is that this is just an innocent request for clarification. How could that be harmful in any way? And questioning that is almost a request for muddying the waters and ambiguity, which you continentals would love, so you can hide in it away from our logical precision or something. I mean, on that first part, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe to go back to how Moore himself used it. I mean, Moore was an incredibly corrosive philosopher. So one of the things he liked to say was that philosophers have found problems about X, Y, and Z. And philosophers, he always meant somebody else, traditional philosophers. But they only thought that there were these problems because they were confused about quite ordinary concepts that we all know how to employ perfectly well. So there was a sort of corrosive edge to the very move of saying, but what's this thing that you're concerned about? I mean, the thing to say, the obvious thing to say just immediately in response to that paragraph in the review is that, I mean, I'm perfectly happy, of course, to clarify what I mean by ideology critique. The fact that I don't offer necessary and sufficient conditions for something's being an ideology critique is something that's entirely consistent with the critique of analytic philosophy that the book contains. So it would be, it would be very, very, it would be very, very odd if I'd done the thing that the reviewer expects here. And B, there's a very interesting phenomenon about the review, which is that it's manifesting precisely the sorts of things that I take as the object of my critique. And that's something very much to be expected. So when Ernest Gellner published his book Words and Things in 1959, he got this, he says, analytic philosophers linguistic philosophers, Oxford linguistic philosophers talk in these and these and these and these ways. And of course, what you'll expect is that when I publish this book, they'll say, oh, but there are people among us who don't do some of the things that you say. And this is exactly the response that he gets. And that's interesting, sociologically interesting to look at. So clarification, of course, is fine. And explaining what you mean is something that analytic philosophers don't have a monopoly on. So, someone like Merleau-Ponty spends hundreds and hundreds of pages explaining what he means by perception with great clarity and rigor. So again, those are things that the analytic philosophers don't have a monopoly on. I think it remains true that there is a practice of saying, now, what exactly do you mean? Which is, I think, closely related to the practice of saying, I think you're confused, which is a way of saying, not, there's something that you've said that seems to me confused and I can't understand, but it's actually projecting the incomprehension back into the other person. Both of which, I don't know what you mean, or you're confused, are ways of basically stalling or stopping the conversation. Whereas what exactly do you mean by is a way of just sort of corrosively digging into what the other person is trying to say. Of course, there are contexts in which what exactly do you mean by is used perfectly innocently. If you asked me a question in this discussion and I said, and I just wasn't quite sure what you meant, I could ask you what exactly you mean by. So there's a question of study of the cumulative use of this kind of locution and what function it serves. And of course, again, it's not that I think that every time that question is wielded, one has to be critical of it. And it's unfortunately a thing that people just have to make their minds up about by making their own observations, right? Whether or not this is a predominant practice in the field and whether or not it should be interpreted as disturbing. And others may well take a different view on this from the one that I take. So again, because it's a historical book, a lot of my claims are of the form, there's this thing that happens a lot, or that's prevalent, or that's characteristic of a certain period or of a certain person. And I can't prove that in the sense that, you know, I could do a logical proof, but you wouldn't really expect those sorts of things to be amenable to such proofs. So yeah, I guess it's taken me a while to get to this as the answer, but I think actually the answer to the question is, it's perfectly fine for that question, what exactly do you mean by to be turned on me, if it's turned on me not in the way that it's used in philosophy seminars, but in the innocent way, and then, you know, that's fine.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. With what you said, that I think that there's often this move that some people can make of, I think it's called in the sort of like rationality circles, they refer to the people, they say, you know, there are high decouplers and low decouplers, and often there are some questions. I'm not accusing this author of doing that, but that, you know, they'll sometimes say, sometimes that's very closely then connected to the idea of, you know, the high decouplers are the high IQ ones because they can engage in this process of decoupling and all sorts of, you know, questionable views about IQ baked in there. But the idea is, and I think it's one that's maybe present in analytic philosophy because of a certain way of thinking about language, that like the statement on its own is like innocuous and like obviously a request for, you know, just the statement on its own, like what do you mean by that? Well, that would be a good, like, why do you not want clarity? Do you not want clarity or something? Like, what do you mean? But when you look at the communicative context that it's being used in, it's like, well, how does that function? Well, the person has to be asking in a way where there's like a standard that could be met, and where, you know, like their participation in accepting a particular kind of explanation is almost required for that to actually work. And you could teach this bit, you could, you know, a linguistic technology that could be taught to a certain kind of person is like, look, there's this bit of language people are inducted in where they're so trained that they will innocuously feel an impulse to respond to what you're saying and take you, you know, not delegitimize what you were doing, but actually you can just you can reject any kind of, you know, response that they give you, and always say, oh, well, it doesn't meet my criteria. And then you can kind of say, so that, you know, I'm better than you and I'm so much clearer on the Now, that is all a bit of a gross caricature of what some people may or may not be doing. But I certainly think that, you know, to not say that that's one thing that actually even does frequently go on in philosophy, you know, is to just miss a large part of what some people seem to be doing.
It's curious as well. I mean, of course, this question is used, and the italicized exactly is of course important as well. But question is wielded a lot in these discussions. You know, what exactly do you mean by such and such? And of course, the correct response, the response that conforms with the rules of the game, isn't, well, I define X thusly. You know, X is something is X if and only if blah, 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 blah. That would be naive, right? So the response is actually something like, well, I actually don't, basically, I don't know, or, you know, something like, well,
oh, well, look, he's not got a clue what he's talking about. Ha, you know, that's the response that you'll get. Yeah. Okay. So we can talk about some more of the things in that review, but I derailed you just to maybe then, if we wrap up on Moore. So you're talking about Moore is historically, at least in part, responsible for this type of locution that catches on in philosophy. And so maybe just to round off then Moore's kind of influences, and what are some of the other main impacts and influences that Moore has?
So I think it's largely actually methodological. So this sort of air of common sense and the air of, well, we kind of already know. By the way, but Moore used to ask these questions and apparently used to stick his tongue out as well, which I think was quite intimidating. People didn't quite know how to deal with this. Somebody said, I think it might have been Virginia Woolf, said Moore silenced a generation, just sort of through these sorts of tactics. I mean, of course, Moore's immediate influence, this takes us right back to the beginning of our discussion in a way about, you know, directionality, different kind of directionality of influence, because Moore has this profound effect on other members of the Bloomsbury group. So his book Principia Ethica, published in 1903, was described. I forget who. I think John Maynard Keynes said it was the opening of a new heaven upon a new earth. And somebody, I think Lytton Strachey, said it was from 1903 that the age of reason could be dated. And Virginia Woolf called it something like the book that made us all so wise and good. So it had this enormous impact. But the reason it had this impact was it was this tremendous validation of the values of the Bloomsbury group. So what Moore celebrates at the final chapter, The Ideal, of his book on ethics, is a certain kind of civilized conversation between friends and enjoyment of art, which were, the highest values of the Bloomsbury group and sustained by them. So in a sense, he's, by validating them, by validating their values, he's then able to act as a sort of figurehead for the group, and thereby have the sort of philosophical influence over the whole phenomenon of Bloomsbury, but in a sense because of his responsiveness to what they stand for. So he has this enormous immediate influence, and then an influence that sort of percolates through Cambridge philosophy, certainly up to the Second World War, and a bit beyond, I think, in terms of the followers and disciples that he's created that do philosophy in this kind of mode. And then sort of relative to that really fizzles out in the latter part of the 20th century. So I think Ray Monk, who's written a lot on the history of analytic philosophy, wrote an article at some point called something like "How is it that G.E. Moore, who's once sort of the world's most famous philosopher, has been completely forgotten?" But yeah, I think his influence lives on, very strongly in this, sort of tutorial technique, which associated with Oxbridge modes of philosophy, which apparently still, this kind of practice still exists of well, you've written your essay, but now, what does any of this mean?
Okay.
So Nikhil Krishnan, who wrote this very interesting book on the history of Oxford philosophy called A Terribly Serious Adventure, talks about his own education in Oxford. And I think he says even in 2007, he was being asked this kind of, but what exactly do you mean question that was supposed to act as a sort of philosophical analgesic or something. It's supposed to have this sort of hygienic effect. As they used to describe in the sort of older obituaries of Oxford philosophers, there would be ex-students who would praise them and say, we were basically inoculated against confusion and vagueness and so on, as if it was a kind of, as if they were sort of nurses that were giving you these treatments.
I'll say that I think that's almost like, as I mentioned before about the conceptual confusion point. That's almost what's so disconcerting for me reading this social history book, is that some of these things, when I engage with people who are trained in contemporary like analytic metaphysics or whatever, and they're sometimes lawyering for very strange positions, taking terms from sort of natural language and coming up with theories about them which are defended on the basis of intuitions, or that they're more desirable because they can be put in formalisms of a certain kind. That way of thinking of like, I've got a clearer way of seeing how this language operates, and I can see that you've borrowed that from some piece of natural language, and if only I can get you to see the strange ways that you've adopted and started using language, well, then you'll be clear about why these problems are coming up, and you'll no longer be kind of like plagued by these. But like, that sort of thing is definitely there in my own thinking. I don't think it's all bad or anything, but I guess what's disconcerting for me, being someone who's not, from the same class or had the same opportunity to be held up by an institutional power having these techniques and things, it's like I don't know, kind of off-putting to see it through that alternative lens of like, oh God, this is kind of, like there's some kind of weird social games going on there almost of like, I'm the one in the position to really say what's going on. And, it like delegitimizes, or it doesn't leave space then for a collaborative endeavor of figuring out like a shared picture of reality or understanding why these concerns are understood by the other person or something. So that's just I don't know, a strange reflection on my thoughts reading that stuff.
Well, I mean, in a way, it's maybe an odd thing to say, but I'm sort of pleased in a sense that that's part of the effect of the book, because I want to, disturb at least a sense of the naturalness of analytic philosophy as just the way that we do philosophy that's prevalent in so many places, just to get people to think about why it might seem so natural and how some of those things operate. Just to get reflection going, really, and open up a space for people to think, should we not be moving philosophy in other directions?
So obviously I'll call it there, but and we can do something in, I've got time next week and the week after actually, and I can message you about that. But the book, if people want to get it after this or in the meantime, where is the best place for people to get a hold of this? And
one place is Verso themselves, or otherwise, any bookshop should be able to get them to sell it to you.
Awesome. And then if there's are there any places you would want to direct people to if they're interested in like more of your work that stuff can be found?
I have a website, so christophschuringa.com, where I try to put links to most of the things I've done. So that's probably a good place to have a look.
Awesome. I'll put both of those. I'll put links to the publishers, thing of the book and your website in the description as well if people want them. So thank you for coming on and giving up your time. Unfortunately, we only got through, a small part of the book, but we can do something and get through the rest of it because there's tons more interesting stuff. In particular, I think the modal metaphysics part has a lot of relevance to what people are talking about a lot of the time in, cutting edge analytic philosophy today. Thanks everyone. Thank you for coming on. I'll end the stream there.
That was really enjoyable.